CSG is a region-based membership organization that fosters exchange of insights and ideas to help state officials shape public policy. CSG's mission is to champion excellence in state governments in order to advance the common good. CSG's Occupational Licensure Project is a workforce product that was funded by a grant awarded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration. Here's the disclaimer that this is a CSG product and it is copyrighted by the Council of State Governments. CSG has published a series of policy briefs on credential mobility and transparency, including portability policies for justice-involved individuals, credential transparency, Alabama launches credential registry, and comparing universal licensure recognition and interstate compacts. CSG has hosted a series of webinars on occupational licensure compacts, including Interstate Compacts 101 and Compacts in Action. And we also produced the National Occupational Licensing Database in partnership with the National Conference of State Legislatures and the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices with grant support from the U.S. Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration. And now I'll hand it over to Janine Leprad from the National Skills Coalition to further introduce herself and NSC's work.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you. I am Janine Leprad, and I am currently serving as the Managing Director for the Policy and Research team here at the National Skills Coalition. Prior to joining NSC, I was with an organization based here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, called the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. And during my tenure with that organization, I had the pleasure of doing a significant amount of work with state governments and other entities that were focusing on competency-based learning and credentialing. And it's a privilege and an honor to be here today to share a bit more with you about the work that the National Skills Coalition has been doing to really work with state government leaders and other stakeholders on really defining and being able to measure the quality of these non-degree credentials. I'm going to share a bit with you today about this quality-based work and talk a little bit about the relationship between credential quality and transparency and portability. The National Skills Coalition is a coalition based in Washington, D.C., and we have been working for over 20 years to advocate for skills-based training that we really see as the backbone for our economy. And through our work, which is really grounded in our state-based coalitions and networks, we've also more recently begun to do a lot of work with state policy leaders on a set of issues related to a campaign called Making College Work for All. And this campaign is really nested in a broader commitment that the National Skills Coalition has made to ensuring that the economic recovery coming out of the pandemic is really an inclusive recovery and one that helps all people get access to quality non-degree credentials and the workforce education and training that we know matters in the labor market today and will only be mattering even more. This platform is really focused on defining quality non-degree credentials of states, helping states establish frameworks for defining quality, as well as being in a place to measure quality with the data systems and infrastructure that states have in place currently. As we think about the array of credentials that are in this non-degree category, we are including certificates, apprenticeship-related certificates and credentials, as well as industry certifications and occupational licenses. Much of what I'm going to be sharing with you today is really based on the work we've been doing that centers more on what community colleges and other education and training institutions are doing to offer shorter-term training programs. And it's important to note that from an occupational licensing perspective, there is a lot happening in states, thanks to the work that CSG and others have been doing to make sure that occupational licenses are allowing folks to really be able to have access to upward and labor market mobility. And so what we know about the non-degree credential space right now is that in general, it's growing. And we also know that in many cases, it's very hard to measure the quality of these credentials and the training programs that are in place. We also know that there are a number of folks who do have professional certifications and licenses. And we also know that while for Black and Latino students, many of them are earning non-degree credentials, there's actually fewer of them that are obtaining occupational licenses that really do lead to quality jobs and that economic mobility. So this is an area where I think I was excited to be invited to this webinar, because this is an area where I think it's important for us to share with you all what we're doing on the quality side of things, and then begin to look for ways to sync up with what we're doing on the quality side with what's happening on the occupational licensing side in terms of transparency and portability. So as I said, one of the ways in which we're working with states is to help states define and develop what we're considering to be robust quality assurance frameworks. And again, in the case of occupational licenses, this kind of quality assurance framework is in place and is really kind of a backbone for ensuring that folks have access to related training and the credentials in that area. We're seeing that there's great opportunity for states to be developing these assurance frameworks that can be applied to not only post-secondary ed related training and funding, but also to the Workforce and Innovation and Opportunity Act related funding as another example. So many of the states we're working with are developing these frameworks and applying it to their eligible training provider list, as well as looking to apply these frameworks to their post-secondary education related training investments. In addition to establishing these frameworks, states are also looking at other policies and practices that create more equitable access to these shorter term training programs and credentials. And they're also making sure that, again, on the quality side of things, that there's also transparency in terms of students knowing which programs are going to be most likely leading them to high quality jobs, including jobs that pay livable wages, as well as these career pathways that lead to greater economic mobility and wealth. So NSC has been working with over 12 states to develop what we're calling a consensus definition of quality. And this definition is really being grounded in a number of criteria that we've been working with states to develop. So we started working with six states and then added a few more in who we knew were also developing these quality assurance frameworks and were interested in collaborating across states to make sure that while we know that there's always variability in terms of how states are going to define and measure these credentials, we also wanted to be able to move toward as much of a consensus definition as possible. In addition to working closely with these states, we also did a lot of stakeholder engagement in the states to make sure that these frameworks and the definition we were developing were really grounded in what the needs of students and businesses were, as well as the education and training providers, in being able to know that states were investing in these programs and these credentials in ways that matter to both students and businesses in the labor market. A lot of this work that we've been doing with states has been supported through the Lumina Foundation. And so a lot of states have the impetus for this, or the focus on this, has really come out of states setting these broader credential attainment goals, and then recognizing that non-degree credentials, as well as non-credit workforce education and training, are really a critical part of helping the state meet their credential attainment goals. And again, really an important part of helping workers and businesses also make sure that what's happening in the labor market from a credential attainment perspective meets local community needs, as well as the needs of workers and businesses. And so as I mentioned, there's great flexibility in how states are really beginning to define these quality non-degree credentials, as well as how they're beginning to operationalize these definitions. And what's important to note is that while there is this flexibility and there's just variance from one state to the next, we are starting to see greater alignment, and we're also starting to see a lot of important collaboration across states, which I think is essential, especially as Jeff will be sharing more about the current state of the work around credential transparency and portability. In the case of occupational licenses, this kind of state collaboration and consensus building is really critical for not only defining these things, but also really being able to measure them from one state to the next. So here are the 5 criteria that NSC has worked with these states to define as part of the consensus definition we've developed. And these criteria are kind of framed at a high level, and then each state is really taking these criteria and figuring out not only where to be applying them to which programs, but also how it is that the state's going to be able to measure things at a disaggregated level to know whether or not all those who are interested in having access to these credentials and these shorter term training programs are able to get the access. So in terms of these the criteria, the main one that states are starting with is really making sure that there's solid evidence of substantial job opportunities related to this credential, as well as making sure that employers are engaged in the process and there's a mechanism in place to have confirmation that these credentials are being used in the hiring, retention, and promotion decisions that businesses are making. There's also work to develop a process and the evidence by which we can see whether or not competencies are being mastered through the attainment of these credentials, as well as making sure that the post-attainment employment and earnings outcomes reflect the intention of these shorter-term programs and the credentials that they're obtaining. And then last, the stackability of these credentials is really critical for the transparency and the portability of them. So we know that many of these credentials are really a first step along a pathway toward another educational credential or a career pathway. So it's really important that we have the data and information needed to know what the quality of these programs looks like, and then the stackability of them in order to help students really get on a pathway and be able to move in the directions that they want to be heading in. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just delving into what's happening here from state to state around these different criteria. So with regard to the evidence that states are establishing for making sure that these credentials are leading to substantial job opportunities, states are looking at an array of things from employment projections to making sure they have access to real-time data and information about these occupations and the targeted industries, as well as making sure that the job opportunities and these credentials align with what state economic development priorities are. States are often establishing different mechanisms for working with businesses to validate these credentials. Some of them are establishing specific advisory committees to do this work. Some of them are connecting the processes into industry sector partnership work that's happening in the states. And some of them are actually developing survey mechanisms to be able to work with businesses on this validation side of things. Here's an example of how Alabama has approached this criteria for in-demand occupations. I think what's most important to note about this is that they've really done their best to make sure that there's specificity around these occupations from a regional perspective, but also have established a process and some criteria for making sure then that from a statewide perspective, there is enough of a demand across the state for there to be a significant investment in these credentials and these shorter term training programs. On the evidence of competencies mastered, I think this is where states are really, again, trying to build off existing quality assurance infrastructure or processes and practices that many states have in place tied to occupational licensure, that some states have in place regarding registered apprenticeship programs, and that from a post-secondary ed accreditation perspective, there's also, again, infrastructure in states that allow folks to link up this kind of quality assurance framework or process with other ones that exist in the state. In terms of evidence of employment and earnings outcomes, one of the major questions we're asking states to reflect on when we're working with them is, what do you already have in place to be able to measure both employment and longer term earnings outcomes for these credentials and these shorter term training programs? So right now there's states have the infrastructure in place to do this through their state longitudinal data systems, but what we've been working with states on is really the data policies and the practices that need to be in place to make sure that the data are available, especially at a disaggregated level, for these shorter term non-degree credential programs. And then the other area where we're working with states is really to help them delve deeper into how accessible this data and this information are to students and other people who need to know, want to know about the longer term prospects for these investments in these kinds of programs. So New Jersey is a great example of a state that's doing a lot to kind of advance a current framework that they've put into place for their eligible training provider list. And so they're really looking to expand what they're able to analyze across the programs that are as part of this list and receiving this funding. And they're also really doing some great work to be able to provide students with this kind of data and information in a more clear and transparent way. On the earnings side of things, states are looking at an array of metrics to be able to account for this and to really be able to know what is happening for students on the labor market side of things. And so states are setting up different methods or mechanisms for being able to account for this. And they're also developing some interesting ways to be able to look at, for example, what Louisiana is defining as these on-ramp credentials, which on the surface, because of the wages being paid for these jobs that are associated with some of these on-ramp credentials, they wouldn't necessarily meet some of the earnings thresholds. But if those are linked in a stackable way to other credentials and training programs, then the state is saying, okay, we can count this, we can include this as a quality non-degree credential because it is lined up and it is clearly stacking to these other credentials and employment opportunities. So with the stackability, we have a number of examples of states who are putting together different models and approaches to being able to help students and workers really understand how these credentials and these shorter term training programs map onto other ones. So Indiana, Louisiana, and Ohio have all done some important things in terms of looking at articulation agreements, crosswalks, and also making sure that there really is credit for prior learning and especially work-based learning. So these states have all got some tools to help their education and training providers in their states really begin to do this kind of articulation and stackability work. I'm just going to mention briefly a couple of additional criteria that states are exploring. So the issue of portability related to all of this is so critical, and portability within states, and as this audience knows well, the portability of the occupational licensing is a real critical issue. And states, I think, are doing some interesting work to be able to make sure that these credentials that are being earned are portable within their states. And I think there's more to do around the cross-state portability. And then the other area where states are just beginning to really explore more is how states are looking at defining job quality as it relates to these credentials and shorter term training programs. So states are using these lists and these quality assurance frameworks to really support performance accountability of these programs and these investments. States are using them in planning efforts to really make sure that investments are going into the credentials of value that matter to workers and businesses in the states. States are also really beginning to go deeper into, as I said, just how transparent and clear the data and information related to these credentials are and how available they are to the people that need access to this information to make good choices about their educational and career pathways. And then there's work that states are doing to really be able to begin to codify and put into place from a regulatory perspective these frameworks and the criteria. And so Alabama and Florida are two states that have been pursuing legislation to just make sure that this is, there's a commitment from a state legislative perspective to these efforts. And then there are two other areas where, as I mentioned, we are working with states in addition to helping them both define and be able to measure these. We've been working with states on a related set of policies tied to access and attainment. So it's one thing to be able to define and be able to measure outcomes associated with these programs, and another thing to make sure that there are policies and practices in place that really support equitable access and attainment of these credentials and completion of these programs. So we're working with states on an array of policies in that area, and then we're also working with states to again really look at their data policies and infrastructure to make sure that what they're putting into place from a quality criteria perspective is actually able to be worked with from a data and data systems perspective. If you could go just two more slides. Great. That was the data one. And then I guess just in closing, I wanted to note that everything I've shared today is available through a report that we've developed with the Credential Engine, which is a state policy toolkit that helps states learn more about what's happening on the quality assurance and defining quality side of things, and then really connecting it up with the work that Credential Engine has been doing to help more on the transparency. And again, ultimately, quality and transparency is critical to also ensuring the portability of these credentials in ways that matter from a state perspective as well as a cross-state perspective. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and just give appreciation to the Council of State Governments for inviting me to share more about this work. I look forward to continuing to find ways to create more synergy or connectivity between the work that's happening on the occupational licensing side of things with this quality work I've just described to you today. And now I'm excited to turn this over to Jeff, who's going to take you much deeper into the transparency side of things as well as what they're learning on the licensing side.
Great. Thanks, Janine. And hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Grant. I work as the Credential Solutions Lead here at Credential Engine. And let's see, I guess before this, I was involved in competency-based education programming at a local online university. So have seen the data perspective from a couple different points of view in that work. What I'm going to do is share with you a little about Credential Engine as an organization, but then and a little context around credentials in America. Talk some specifically about the role of occupational licenses and pathways, and suggest a couple ways that states can get involved in this work more directly. So let's see. So Credential Engine, we're a a nonprofit organization. We got founded from a research study Lumina Foundation funded around their goal 2025. And one of the outputs from that work was a realization that although credentials sound like one thing, they're actually many different things. And we have different terminology and policies and processes and stakeholders and communication means and technology to manage all of that information. But ultimately, it's the individual worker or learner that needs to understand the credentialing marketplace. And so to better support decision-making by individuals, we needed a common way to refer to credential information, whether that's a degree program, a certificate, a badge, a micro-credential, certification, a license, an apprenticeship. There are lots of different types of credentials that people are using to secure and advance their careers today. And our mission is around bringing transparency to that marketplace. So we do that in a couple different ways. We, just like through this, we raise awareness and ask for advocacy. Lots of different partners that we work with. One of our primary contributions is the development of a language. It's a what we call the Credential Transparency Description Language schema, the CTDL schema. So if I use that tech term a little bit, you'll know it's the language is what I'm talking about there, to describe everything about a credential. And then we built a registry so people can use that language on the web to be transparent and communicate information about the credentials they offer. One thing I want to do right from the start is just clear up any misconceptions, because this is very easy to happen, that we don't actually deal with any personally identifiable information. So our work isn't about the credentials that individuals have earned or obtained. We don't issue credentials in any way. We don't verify credentials that have been issued to people. We are focusing our efforts around fully describing everything about a credential that's being offered into the market today. We think that is a key component of future market-based, learn and work ecosystem that people can benefit from. So that's a little about us. I'll tell you some about why we think this matters. We've done our own research and counted almost 1 million credentials being offered today in America. So that is really an overwhelming number for anyone to get their heads around. And other industries have benefited from using common definitions to deal with data of that size. So you think Google Maps, you go on Google Maps, it's very easy to find the particular hotel room that you're interested in and the particular pieces of information about that hotel room from the hundreds of thousands of options, maybe 1 million, a lot of options are all presented in a context of an application. So it's important that we enable ways for everyone to benefit from the many credential offerings that are available to us. And that's much of the work that we're advancing. On the next slide, I give you a little breakdown on the credentials we found. I encourage you to check out the link there to download the report yourself. This was from last year, and so we're sure there's more credentials to count. But you can see the different types of categories. It changes over time. This is actually, I think, the third report that we've done in this series. We have there, it has occupational licenses. It's almost 12,000 occupational licenses being used in America. So licenses are a significant part of the ecosystem and important for people's jobs and occupations for sure. So on the next slide, I just kind of iterate that the main point here is that public data about these credentials is a public good, and that's needed to fuel the kind of pathways and empower everyone to make the decisions that they need to advance their careers. So relative to pathways, you can think of that as kind of 3 buckets. One, what are the needs of the individual? And there's a lot of processes and programming around discovering what your career interests are, connecting those in with different offerings. Then there's another bucket, which is all of the different education training opportunities that are in the marketplace. And those can include different credentials that you can obtain, but they could be informal learning opportunities as well. There's a whole host of items in the training opportunity bucket. And then the other side of the this three-part pathway is the workforce demand. What jobs are needed? What kind of skills and competencies are required for what kind of positions? And that's an ongoing dynamic process. In fact, every part of this pathway structure, these three buckets, is dynamic. And so it's important that each element inside them can be richly described because changes happen and the connections amongst them are complex. We've done some research on career pathways in the Midwest and just readily found we counted 700 career pathways being offered, being publicly communicated through government, state agencies, credential providers' websites. So a lot of rich information here for people. On the next slide, I get a little deeper into the role of licenses, and CSG has done some fantastic programming with compacts around making licenses portable. I think of the nursing license, the interstate agreements around through the compacts that permit a person with a license in one state to use that license in another state. What I'm going to do, though, is focus in particular on pre-licensure educational requirements, which is a different part of the story, where each licensing board can define for itself what are the educational requirements to obtain this license. And in that space, there's less transparency, but it is an important part of earning a license. It's particularly important for those individuals who are forced to move between states before having completed, let's say, a degree program. And that can happen for any number of reasons, but we know military populations are impacted by this quite a bit. So I put on the visual here. I mean, there's lots of different ways to represent this complex challenge, information communication challenge. But this is an example from Indiana University for their BSN nursing program. So if you had earned your BSN in Indiana, but hadn't obtained your license yet and wanted to apply for a license in Washington, that degree program wouldn't be recognized. It doesn't meet the state of Washington's licensing requirements to obtain a license in that state. And so that information is very important, of course, to students who are pursuing those degree programs. And they have built a very sophisticated, it seems like well, it's a visual display of a database that must have hundreds of, well, certainly thousands of rows denoting for each of the 50 states, each of the licenses in those states, each of the degree programs that they offer. Does the degree program meet, not meet, or is it unknown, the relationship to the pre-licensure educational requirements? So this is just one example, but every university and college that offers programming related to an occupational license is federally mandated by Title IV legislation to disclose this information to each student. And so it is a tremendous amount of work. And our position is that the more everyone can be transparent about the requirements to obtain a license and the relevancy of the skills and competencies for that license, the easier it'll be for everyone to understand these connection points in their career pathway. So happy to talk more about that, but the summary point is here that we think transparency leads to transformation. And the three parts we call out are a common language, a common format using the registry, and openly accessible on the web. Lots of other industries use just the open web to exchange meaningful data. I'll skip over the many benefits here and maybe then focus in on the role of the states, because I think that'll be most relevant to this audience. we've done at Credential Engine is define a roadmap that lays out a sequence of steps that we think all states will go through as they advance credential transparency. So this can be relevant whether you're this is the first time you've heard about this work, or you're fairly advanced, that there's many different ways to get involved. So there are 10 steps in the roadmap. We bucketed them into these 6 categories. Often it's just kind of understanding where this fits in your state and advocating for it, making the case with other partners, because it's a fairly significant suite of projects and initiatives that relate to credential transparency. I'll just call out that you'll find that your state probably is already involved in this in some way or another through your existing initiatives related to education workforce data systems. And the work of assembling that information in the registry is fairly defined. We have workflows that can either connect with IT systems directly or embed in a manual workflows that may exist. But getting data into the registry isn't the only thing, it's also using those data. And so we've partnered with many different product and service companies and custom state visualization tools to make these data available to many different stakeholders. And it's the last point here about enduring commitment is that it shouldn't be thought of as a project per se. It's really embedding it into the roles, the processes, the ongoing funding and support to make this part of the state's strategy for economic growth and worker success. So that's an overview. Where we're at now is we do have 28 states and regions that are actively involved. This is our partner map. We're proud to have added Texas within the last month to the state partner list here. Each of these states have signed an MOU that are committing them to credential transparency, picking up where they're at and advancing on that roadmap. And you can see kind of a clustering in the Midwest. So I've been involved in some of our community of practice work in connecting credential transparency advocates together and sharing best practices and creating resources in the Midwest. So it's really work though that anyone can get involved in. There's lots of different roles. And so I think what I do on the next slide is just start going through a couple of the important action items that people can take. And of course, anything this large, strong leadership is very much needed and helpful. We've recently been partnering with the National Governors Association on their learning and employment records work. If you haven't heard of that, it's a advanced form of a digital credential, a digital record that individuals can have that contains within it the detailed information about their achievements, and that that can be exchanged with other people in a consistent way. And so that is one suite of work related to how transparent credential information can be used. But there's many other opportunities, in strategy documents, being explicit about the role of credential data is very helpful to initiate and connect different agencies together. On the next slide, I talk some about legislators. Definitely a role for legislative action here. We have some policies that have been moving through different states. Connecticut's probably our most advanced set of policies that have been passed, I think, last year, fairly explicit about the role of and expectations regarding credential transparency for public institutions in the state. So I'd encourage you to look at that as a model. Often, there is funding associated with both the change management, the training, the systems development. So those funds are much needed and appreciated, as well as connecting the outputs from credential transparency with the intended outcomes for the state around, credential attainment goals, economic growth. It could be sector specific. There's a variety of connection points there called out. On the next slide, I talk a little about state agencies. There's lots of different agencies are often intersecting with credential data. And what we found is that they benefit from this work because it can reduce duplication. It can help build data sharing agreements across agencies between a Department of Education, workforce development units. And so that is another, we've seen many strong sets of leaders come from different state agencies who can often articulate the benefit of working across agencies and help show and help others learn how to set up those kinds of agreements. On the next slide, I mentioned some of the benefits here for education training providers. This is how I got started with this work. And it's just true that actually, if you're doing this kind of credentialing programming, you're reliant on many different tools operating together as a unit. And rarely are there clear or consistent data connections. So you might have one tool that's operating your website, another tool that's managing the catalog information about your credentials, another that deals with the learning management system, another that deals with the digital diploma that an individual obtains, and the counseling software that manages the course plans or degree plans of individuals. These can all be totally different systems with their own sourcing of information and challenges of keeping the information coordinated across the university. So the benefits here are often around good data governance and visibility into the programming that is in place, so they can benefit from a variety of innovations that invariably leaders are interested in pursuing. And finally here, I'll just mention that this is very relevant to businesses and employers as they seek talent for their roles. It's being explicit about the role of skills and competencies in job descriptions is another important element of this work. We've been concerned nationally that there is a tendency towards what's called credential inflation, requiring credentials where they may not be required, which can pose equity challenges that are excluding talented people from successful careers. And this kind of reflective work that businesses and employers could do is advancing equity goals and helping then make the actual needs that they have more explicit through data practices, through job descriptions, and the registry supports that work through, especially through career pathways most directly. So as you can tell, there's many different opportunities for folks to get involved in credential transparency, and it is one of the benefits of working with us is through promoting collaboration amongst these different stakeholders. So just to kind of leave you with a couple of specific action items here, we're saying that you can actually act now. We have many resources on our site that can be readily used to advance this work within your state, even if you're not on that map today. Would encourage you to look at the toolkit resources that are available there. And honestly, just hearing about this work and raising your awareness helps you become then an advocate for it through your conversations with others in the programming that you're advancing through your role. So thanks for taking the time. I'd be actually saving as much for discussions, but here's my contact info as well in case you have any specifics you'd like to follow up on. I'd welcome that. So thank you. Thanks CSG too for the opportunity to talk about this topic.
Thank you, Jeff. And just for everyone, all the participants, now we have mine and Adam's contact information up here if you have any questions for us after this. But right now we have some time for question and answer. So you can put your question in the chat or you can unmute if you would like to just speak your question out loud. I have one question that came in, I think directed to Jeff, but if you'd both like to speak to it, feel free. Let's see, do you have any initiatives in particular to address credential mobility for veterans or military spouses?
Well, yes. So veterans and military spouses are also participating in the larger credentialing market. So in some ways, you know, our core programming would be relevant to those populations. I think some of the more specific military transitions from the military into civilian career pathways is something that several of our states are interested in, and probably the most specific programming there relates to the MOS codes. I know there's ways that the military will represent a variety of competency demonstrations through the different roles that they obtain. And we have partners who are actively doing programming in that space, and they are utilizing the CTDL schema for facilitating that mapping of a MOS code to SOC codes or SIP codes that can then provide the recommendations to individuals about what credentials might most align with their previous experiences.
And I would just add that a number of states, as they're looking to define quality and make sure that the kind of data and information that Jeff was just describing is available to know more about, like, who is getting access to these programs and these credentials. There's important work to do around veterans and people with military experience to know where are they right now in the labor market, and where are they trying to get access to these programs, and how can we make things easier, clearer, more transferable, as Jeff was just describing. So I think the ability to be able to disaggregate the data and information about these credentials and programs helps states understand how military service people and veterans are being served or not by these investments in these programs.
We had another question come in to us directly. I think this person asked, as we are coming out of or still in the midst of a pandemic, are there specific sectors or industries that you think either of you have found this work to be particularly impactful, especially with, you know, recent healthcare shortages over the last several years, and other sectors that might be more directly impacted by credential transparency?
Yeah, well, I can say I know, you know, a lot of our state partners are actively reflecting on the systems and that they have in place and recognizing gaps that don't permit them the type of flexible communication and cross-agency collaboration that would be needed in a more dynamic credentialing market. So, you know, I think you know, at this point, we're still in a situation where those credential providers that are most responsive to the market are the ones who are first to act and address healthcare, you know, credentialing gaps that exist as people try to transition from even within the healthcare sector from one role to another to address the specifics of the pandemic. But that type of information is relevant not just to the, you know, early adopting kind of very capable credential providers, but to even small micro credential providers that have a more focused role in addressing specific gaps often that might exist where someone's moving from a highly qualified position but have a missing piece related to skills and competencies that are very important. How can they transition better with better information?
I would just add that NSC is working with, specifically with about 8 states right now that are all in the process of both defining and measuring quality and trying to apply that to existing financial assistance programs for these credentials. So in the case of Minnesota, Michigan, and Arkansas, they're doing like reviews right now of existing policies, the criteria they're using, et cetera, and they're really trying to understand whether these existing programs are meeting the needs that are emerging from the pandemic or not. And if they're not, then they're also doing some work to try to better align or streamline or focus these programs. So Arkansas is a great example where they have a workforce skills scholarship program. It is targeted towards 3 specific sectors, including healthcare. And they're really stepping back from that and saying, okay, we know this scholarship matters right now, but is it being targeted in the right way at the right, now at this point in time for what's happening with the labor market?
We had another question. Oh, sorry, Adam. We had another question come through the chat. Are states creating bridges between the high school and training programs? And are there resources to cover the cost of those certification tests?
I know I'll just share that we are extending our programming into secondary connection points for especially related to career pathways. Just last year, we got some generous support from the Walton Foundation to focus in on 5 states that are pursuing that kind of programming where there might be diplomas as a credential, but also a variety of supplemental certificate programs, student competitions, a variety of ways that students are trying to enter into alternative to different career paths. And so that is something that some of our state partners are focusing in on. It also pertains to how transcripts are used in the state and how information gets documented on those transcripts so that it can be understood and consumed by post-secondary providers. The funding question would probably be more directed towards a specific initiative with state that would be supporting that kind of programming.
Yeah, I just included a link to some work that's happening in Ohio, which is really is coming out of the career and technical ed space. And I think that work is really trying to help build bridges between these high school programs, career and tech ed programs, and the credit and credentials associated with those to these post-secondary ed programs. And I think in that example, they're beginning to identify ways in which funding would be available to support and pay for whatever is needed, not only the tuition to be able to go to these programs, but other related supports and services like having the money to be able to get this sit for an exam or actually get the certification that is needed or the license that's needed.
And I think we have time for one last question related to those scholarships. Is there a service requirement for the scholarship? For example, working in the field for a certain amount of years in exchange for a scholarship?
That's a great question. In the case of Arkansas, I don't think there is, but that is something that other states are looking at, which is to create an incentive also for those who have been working for a period of time to be able to take advantage of these financial aid programs for these shorter term credentials. And so I think there's also some, these the Reconnect initiatives. A lot of the Reconnect initiatives haven't been as focused on these shorter term credentials, and we're now seeing states really looking at these college promise programs and their Reconnect programs to just try to create more incentive for those who have been working to really try to get access to another credential or stepping stone into a new opportunity in the labor market.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank both of our speakers for being here with us today. And just a reminder to everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available at licensing.csg.org/webinars. So thank everyone very much for participating.